So thank you, Jim and Ida and Sharon and Brad for organizing the meeting and inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. This is a really wonderful meeting. So we heard a lot about faces in the past couple of days, and we know that most studies on person recognition actually focused on faces. However, in real life, we are not surrounded by floating faces. Faces are typically attached to the body, and they sometimes talk, and they often move. And what we've been trying to do in our lab in the past few years is to try to study how those additional sources of information about the person, the body, the voice, and motion may contribute to person recognition beyond the face and under what circumstances. Now, another gap between the way we study faces in the lab and real-life person recognition, which was already discussed this morning, is the fact that most of the studies that we have ran to learn about the face system were based on studies that are using unfamiliar faces. Whereas in real life, unless you are working as a passport officer or as a face examiner, we hardly ever need to match two different faces or even two different unfamiliar faces. What we typically do when we see a face is we try to figure out whether it's familiar or unfamiliar. And the way we do that is by matching a perceptual representation of a face to a stored representation that we have in our memory. And based on that, we decide whether the person is familiar or not. And then we know how to behave towards that person. And one important thing to remember about these stored representations that we have about familiar faces is that they are not only perceptual, but they are also conceptual. So one of the things that we are trying to do in the lab in the past few years is to try to understand how the conceptual representation of faces contribute both to face learning and face recognition. So I won't have time to talk with you about all of these different topics. I just chose two separate studies that are going to give you a taste on each of those two lines of research. And I'm going to start with something that we already talked about this morning, how we recognize familiar faces. And I'm going to talk about studies that Naftali Aburdaham in my lab has run in the past few years. Then I'm going to switch to a different question and ask what's the neurorepresentation of the whole person in face and body-selective cortex. And at the end, I'm going to talk, this is done by Libby Clear in my lab, and then I'm going to talk about the role of motion in whole person recognition. This is work done by Noah Simchi in my lab, who is here, and also presented a poster on this data. So let's start with familiar faces. We already talked about familiar faces, so this is going to be a continuation of the previous discussion. So I think, and that was discussed already this morning, one of the most intriguing findings in the literature about familiar and unfamiliar faces, mainly from work that Rob and Mike Burton has been doing, is this indeed difference between face matching for familiar and unfamiliar faces, the fact that it's much better for familiar than unfamiliar faces. We've seen examples in the morning, and there are more and more examples that you can come up with, showing that for the same type of stimuli, we have much better performance for familiar and unfamiliar faces. And again, it's important to emphasize, and I totally agree with Bruno, it's not that we are hopeless with unfamiliar faces. We can do pretty well, but I think we can, it's still important to try to account for this gap in performance. So about 70% if those are unfamiliar to the subjects, and for the same stimuli, 90% if you are familiar with them. And I think the interesting thing about this task, I mean, there is no time limit. The faces can be very high resolution, and still we can perform pretty poorly. So the main way in which this gap between familiar and unfamiliar face matching has been accounted for is the fact that we have very rich perceptual experience with familiar faces. So hard to believe, but these are all images of the same individual. This is a famous Spanish actress, so I don't know whether any of you is familiar with her, but I mean, if you were familiar with her, you would be able to generalize across the different images. Whereas if you are not, it's very hard. And there are several suggestions of what is actually going on during the process of familiarization. So the main idea here was that there is a change in the way the perceptual representation of familiar faces. So one idea was that there is a shift from representing external features to internal features when we move from an unfamiliar to a familiar face. Or another idea is that we're using different diagnostic features for different familiar faces. So with this experience we learn to extract the important features for each familiar face and disregard the features that are they vary across the different appearances. So I'm going to call these ideas the perceptual hypothesis. The idea is that there are different features that we use for familiar and unfamiliar faces. However, what I would like to actually show you today are data which actually suggest something different. They are actually going to suggest that we're using the same features for familiar and unfamiliar faces. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to propose a conceptual account for this gap in performance between familiar and unfamiliar faces. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend the next 15, 20 minutes trying to answer these questions. Are we using the same features for familiar and unfamiliar faces? First, I'm going to show you a method that we use in order to answer the questions, which features are actually used for face identity. Then I'm going to show you that those features that we discovered are used for unfamiliar face matching, familiar face matching, familiar face recognition, and also by deep neural networks. And then at the end, given that we're using, I'm going to show you we're using the same features for familiar and unfamiliar faces, I'll try to propose a conceptual account for this gap in performance. So in order to answer these very basic questions of what features are used for face identity, what we did is we used the reverse engineering approach and defined critical features, I mean features that we used for the identity of the face, as features that if we change them, that would change the identity of the face. So what do we mean by changing features? Let's say that we start with this face, and we can start changing different features for a given face. So we can change the hair, for example. We can change the eyebrows. We can change the eye shape. We can change the lips, okay? And you see that this generates a new face. Or we can change skin color. You can change face proportion. You can change the nose, different nose, hard to see, and different mouth. And I think we can already see that there are some features that when we change them, the identity changed more than when we change other features. And the question is which features are important, and also by how much we need to change them in order to change the identity of the face. So this is what we try to do. We try to come up with this metric. So these are the studies that Naftali Abudam did in my lab. We started with a list of 20 different features that pretty much cover most of the information that we have in the face. So for example, skin color, skin texture, face proportion, eyebrow thickness, and so on. And we ask subject, and the metric is going to be based on subject perceptual ratings. So we ask subject to rate each of those different features on a set of like 100 faces. So how bright is the skin? How wide are the lips? How dark is, how narrow is the face? So for each of those 20 features, they have to rate those different faces, different features independently. So then we can come up with a list of values for each face. So we have a feature vector for each face of those 20 numbers. We also normalize them so we can compare between features. And now we can represent this face in a face space with 20 different dimensions. And we can measure the distance between our different faces in our database based on what we call the face space distance, the distance between feature vectors of 20 numbers of those 20 features. And now in order to find out whether those features are actually used for face identity, what we can do is we can correlate this face space distance with a perceptual distance score, which is by asking another group of subjects, just tell me from 1 to 6 how similar or different are the two faces. And if those two measures are correlated, that means that the face space is valid. So this is the correlation that we get between those two measures based on the face space distance that use information from all the 20 features. And this correlation is pretty good, suggesting that the face space does represent something which is relevant to the identity of the face. But what we're wondering is whether there is actually a subset of features that we can use that can account for differences in identity. And one thing that we realized that when we asked subject to rate those different features, there are some features for which we got higher inter-rater agreement, such as lip thickness and eyebrow thickness, versus there are other features for which we got lower agreements, such as mouth size and eye distance and chin shape. Okay, and we got these measures both when we asked subject to do the rating as the same as I showed you, but also when we asked them to compare faces across those different features. So which one has thicker eyebrows, which one has larger nose. The same, for those two methods, we got actually something very similar in terms of the inter-rater agreement. And we interpret this finding as that this inter-rater agreement may reflect what I'm going to call now perceptual sensitivity. We have higher perceptual sensitivity to detect differences between eyebrow thickness than detect differences between different noses, okay? So I'm going to use the term high perceptual sensitivity for features for which we have high inter-rater agreement and low perceptual sensitivity for features for which we have low inter-rater agreement. And now the question is whether features for which we have high perceptual sensitivity are more used for judging identity than feature for which we have low perceptual sensitivity. So to answer this question, what we did is we computed the phase space distance instead of based on all 20 features on just a subset of these features. And what you actually see here is the same correlation that I'm showing you here between perceptual distance and phase space distance, but the phase space distance is computed based on either one feature, two features, three features, up to 20 features. This is the correlation that I showed you before. And you see that the more features I'm adding, the correlation gets higher. But then what you also see that I don't actually need all the 20 features. I only need the first 5 features. First 5 high PS features gets me the same correlations that we got with the 20 features, okay? And then when I do the same thing, but just going from the other side, just adding features from the low PS to the high PS, you see that I'm getting to the top correlations only when those features are used in my phase space measure, okay? So this may suggest that those 5 features may be more important for the identity of the face than other features. So what we can do now is we can use the method that I mentioned to you earlier, changing features that would tell us whether we're using them for face identity. So we can either change the 5 high PS features or the 5 low PS features and see how that is going to influence face identity. So again, I'm showing you that example of face, and I'm changing the high PS features. Now, because all those features are actually numbered in my database, I can, when I change them, I know by how much I change them. And then I'm just taking a hair from someone else from the database and plant it in that face, or I'm changing the eyebrows thickness, the eyes, the eye shape, the eye color, and the lip thickness. So these were the high PS features, and I know by how much I moved my face in database, in the face space. And I can do the same thing for the low PS features, okay? So I'm just making sure that the distance based on the 20 features is the same for the high PS and the low PS changes. And now I can ask subject to tell me whether those pairs of faces in which I change low PS features or high PS features are the same person or different people, okay? And I'm also adding to this task same faces and different faces. And again, and the faces that we chose for the different faces were just randomly faces. We didn't try to make them similar to the original face. And then the subject needs just to rate from 1 to 6 whether this is the same person or not. And what you see, this is the rating that we get for same faces. This is low dissimilarity. For different faces, high dissimilarity. And when they rate faces that were changed with high PS or low PS changes, you see that we get exactly the same score as different faces, which is how we defined critical features. Critical features are features that if you change them, you change the identity of the face. And this is what we got here, okay? So this is what we found for matching unfamiliar faces. And the question is why those features are important. And one possibility is that those features are important because they may be invariant across different appearances of the same face. So in order to find out whether those features are actually invariant, what we did is we used the same task that we used before. So we asked subject to compare 2 faces for each of those 20 features, which one has the larger nose, which one has thicker eyebrows. But we do it both when the faces are facing the same view or when they are facing different views. And the idea is that features that are invariant across different views, our perceptual sensitivity to judge them is going to drop versus features that are not invariant across different views. Okay, so for example, if eyebrow thickness is invariant across view, then saying that this one has thicker eyebrows I'm going to have the same perceptual sensitivity regardless of whether the faces are frontal or from different views. Whereas eye distance, for example, which varies across head views, I'm going to have higher perceptual sensitivity to judge eye distance for same view faces than different view faces. So what I'm going to measure now is by how much perceptual sensitivity actually drops across different views. So this is what you see here. These are the features for which there is large drop, suggesting they are not invariant across different views. And these are the features for which we have no drop, suggesting that they are invariant across different views. And what you see here, these are the high PS features, and these are the low PS features. Okay, so the high PS features are the features that remain invariant across different poses. What you see here is one low PS features that is invariant. This is skin color. So skin color is invariant across head pose, but it might not be invariant across different lighting. Okay? So the idea is that the high PS features are the invariant feature. They're invariant feature across poses, but they're also supposed to be invariant across lighting and expression. And this is why it's useful to use them to identify faces. And again, it's true that we have better generalization for familiar faces, but we also have some ability to generalize also for unfamiliar faces, and this is what enables this generalization across different views and lighting and expression. All right, so what I showed you so far is that those features are used for unfamiliar faces using a face matching task. Now the question is whether they're also used for familiar faces. And what we did is we used the same method with familiar faces. So this is just one example of a familiar face. We used 10 different celebrity faces, and we can do exactly the same thing. We can change features for the familiar faces using features from our database, so we know by how much we move them, or changing mouth, eye distance, face proportion, skin color, and nose. Those are the low PS features. And we can give subject the same task, judging how similar or different are the unfamiliar faces. So by either changing the high PS features, the low PS features, and also having same faces and different faces. And you see that we're getting exactly the same thing. So changing 5 features of Mark Zuckerberg makes it as different as a Mark Zuckerberg and a Robert De Niro. Okay? So by using these 5 features, I can actually change the identity of the face, suggesting that they may be critical for face identity. Okay, so what I showed you here is that we use those features for matching familiar faces and matching unfamiliar faces. But the question is whether we also use them to represent faces in memory. This is whether that also match to the stored representation that we have about familiar faces in memory. And in order to answer that question, we gave our subjects a face recognition task. So I'm going to show you a face now in which we changed 5 high PS features. Our subjects don't know that. They are just presented with a face, and they have to say whether it's familiar or not. So if you think you can recognize that person, just raise your hand. Don't say anything. So this is the face. Can anybody recognize that face? OK, so this is a familiar face in which we changed 5 high PS features. Now I'm going to remove one. So now it's only 4 high PS features. Can anybody recognize that person now? OK, now only 3 high PS features. Anybody can recognize? Not yet? OK. OK, and now? All right. OK, so you look exactly the way our subjects were performing. I'll show you the data. So this is George Clooney changing lip thickness, hair, eye color, eye shape, and eyebrow, and eyebrows. And you see, and these are the low PS. I didn't show you the low PS feature task, but this is the data. So you see that, and this is exactly, I think, that's what we saw here. When we change 4 or 5 high PS features, nobody could recognize the familiar faces. When we changed 3 features, we could recognize only 20% of the faces. And you see this drops very strongly. Whereas when we change the low PS features, we can still recognize the faces even after 4 changes. Okay, so this suggests that we are also using these features to represent familiar faces in memory. What we also did recently together with Brad is that we ran the same task on super recognizers. Right? Super recognizers are very good in face recognition. Are they also going to use the same features, or maybe they are using different features? So this is the data from the control subject that I just showed you with high PS changes. And this is the data from the super recognizers. So you can see that when we get, again, to 4 or 5 changes, super recognizers also cannot recognize familiar faces. Okay? Their slope goes down slower, but by 4 or 5 features, they can also not recognize familiar faces. No, so I mentioned that the way we changed them so the distance between the original and the changed face is similar for the high PS and the low PS changes. So we can always compare it to the low PS. You mean in terms of the order? Yeah. You use different orders. I can show you that at the end. Yeah, it's actually, so there are some features that are more important than the others. I'll show you at the end how the different orders are changing the representation. OK, so we have those high PS features. They seem to be invariant features. They seem to be critical for unfamiliar face matching, familiar face matching, and familiar face recognition. But I think that one thing that may bother you and also bother us is the fact that these are high-level features, and they're also semantic features. The reason we use semantic features is because we needed to communicate the task that we wanted our subjects to do. So it's easier to tell them, compare eyebrows, compare noses, compare lips. But at the end, we don't think that the visual system is using semantic features, right? It's using whatever features that it can use. So what we also want to see is whether if we use another system that is not bound to those semantic labels, whether that system is also going to use those features, whether those features are invariant universally. So for that, we can use deep neural networks. They don't care about the semantic labels of the features, but we can still use the same faces. And we can compare the feature vector of the last layer, something that Alice showed you yesterday, for those pairs of faces. So we can measure the distance between each pairs of these faces and see whether the deep neural network is also more sensitive to high PS features than low PS features, that the distance between those two faces is going to be larger than these two faces. Okay, so this is the data from humans that I already showed you before, and this is what we find for the DNNs. So we see that also the DNN is more sensitive to high PS features than low PS features. And when we looked across the different layers of the network, what we find interestingly is that the low PS features are actually represented in the lower layers. So because these are differences in color and in size, that may be represented in lower layers of the DNN, whereas when we get to the higher layers of the DNNs, we see that they're actually representing the same features that we're using. And the reason that it may use these features, that if these features are indeed invariant across different appearances and lighting and expression, and the system is trained to find these invariant features to generalize across different appearances of the same individual, then those may be useful features to use. Okay? So what I showed you so far is that those features are used for unfamiliar and familiar faces and also by DNNs. And I think by now we can say that this finding may not be consistent with these ideas, that what happens when we move from unfamiliar to familiar, because all faces were once unfamiliar, at some point they become familiar. So we don't really see this shift from external to internal features. For both familiar and unfamiliar faces, we use both external and internal features, and there are some internal features that we are not using, neither for familiar and unfamiliar faces. And our data is consistent with other studies that have been published into literature. So, and actually mainly studies from Pavan's lab. So Pavan already showed us many years ago that hair is very important for face recognition. In many of our studies, we removed the hair, but I think that's one of the most dramatic features, both for familiar and unfamiliar faces. This is another study from Pavan's lab showing that the eyebrows and the eyes are important for face recognition. And one thing that we can do in our study that was not done before is that we can actually separate between eyebrow thickness and eyebrow shape. And what we saw is that eyebrow thickness is important, but eyebrow shape is not important. But by just removing features, you cannot actually get to that detailed representation. And also, this is from a study that Sharon published recently, and there was published by Holdall before, that when we compress faces, we can still recognize them. So that suggests that face proportion and eye distance are not as important to face recognition, the same as we found here with a very different method. So I think by now I showed you enough data which suggests that we may use the same features for familiar and unfamiliar faces. And what I would like to do now is kind of like to propose a conceptual account for the difference between familiar and unfamiliar faces. And to account for those differences. So this is kind of like the idea of what may be going on when we try to do this kind of tasks. So this is a task similar to what Robert has shown you, similar maybe to the Glasgow task. You see two faces. You need to decide whether they're the same or a different person. So what you do, you need to generate a perceptual representation, possibly something similar to just using high PS features. And then you need to measure the distance between those feature vectors to decide whether they're same or different. So this can probably be done by the FFA, by some part of the perceptual system. And if this distance is larger from a given threshold, we may say these are different faces. However, at the same time, we always compare faces that we see to stored representations in memory. Those stored representations in memory are perceptual and conceptual. These are just 3 examples out of the 5,000 that we actually may have there. And they may be also represented using the same coordinates, the same features. And what we need to do is we need to we need to measure the distance between our perceptual representation and our stored representation. And if we cannot find any face that is similar enough to that face, we may say this is unfamiliar. And this may be done in more anterior area, in the extended system or some other system that may also have this conceptual representation. So this is with unfamiliar faces, and although this is the same person, we may think that this is a different person because they are different perceptually. Now let's say that we get this trial, and we again measure the distance between the faces, and because the distance is higher than a given threshold, we may say that these are different faces. But now we can match the perceptual representation to the stored representation in memory, and that stored representation is also linked to some conceptual information. And I can say, well, I recognize that person, this is Nicole Kidman, but I have no clue who is that person, so maybe they are different. But if you watch the movie The Hours, you also know that this is actually Nicole Kidman, and this is how she looks in that movie, trying to look like Virginia Woolf. And in that case, what I would like to suggest that if the two faces are very different from one another, what we may do is we just open a new cluster in memory, a new prototype, if you want a sub-prototype. And what we can do is, instead of just trying to move them together perceptually, we can just link them conceptually. So we may have the perceptual system is going to say, well, they are different, but our conceptual system should be able to link them just because they are both linked to the same conceptual information. So we may not necessarily need to change the perceptual representation if we have conceptual representation that can bypass this and just give us the answer. So what's going on is that the match is not necessarily done perceptually. It may be done, at least to some extent, conceptually. And I think that's actually maybe consistent with the data that Winrich published last year, in which he found that in AM, which is the area where you do have this invariant representation of faces from different views, is actually was showing similar response to familiar and unfamiliar faces. And the difference between familiar and unfamiliar faces was mainly in the more anterior areas. And I think also in humans, in the FFA, we don't find much differences between familiar and unfamiliar, and the difference is mainly in the extended system. And also for visually familiar faces are very different from familiar faces because we don't have any conceptual information about them. We just have the visual training. So also in this data, and I think also the data that Ida was showing this morning, the visual familiar faces we mainly find differences in the perceptual system, but not in the conceptual system. So this is the idea. This is another evidence that such conceptual representation exists. And the reason I like this Halle Berry example is because we have images of Halle Berry here in which her face is fully masked. There is no way we can generalize perceptually across those different faces. And the way we can generalize across them is based on person knowledge. And indeed, those cells are as selective to the person name as to the images of that person. So one of the questions that we are actually interested in right now is what would be the nature of the representation of familiar faces in memory. So rather than just studying how they may differ perceptually, we think that we can actually, there's a fascinating literature on conceptual representation, how concepts are represented in the brain and whether they're represented in an exemplar-based manner or in a prototype-based manner. And there's actually intermediate models that suggest intermediate level of abstraction. And one of the ideas that we are trying to study right now is the idea that for each familiar face, we may not keep one representation, but we may keep multiple representations. They may be very different perceptually from one another, but as long as we can link them conceptually, we can actually account for this amazing generalization that we have for familiar faces. So to summarize what I showed you so far, I showed you that we discovered the subset of features that are used for face identity. And again, I showed you that those features are also found in the deep neural networks. It's not that we think that the network is representing eyebrow thickness or lip thickness. It's storing some information that is correlated with those features. It was convenient to use them because we had to communicate to our subjects which features to measure. What I didn't talk about, but is important to mention, is that those features are learned through experience. Because the fact that what I showed you is that the critical features for Caucasian males, but they may not be important for Asian faces, for example. Okay, we use eye color, we use hair color, which is totally irrelevant for African faces and Asian faces. So we actually learn these features through experience. And what I also would like to emphasize is that we think that we are actually learning them mostly based on our experience with familiar faces, and they apply them also to unfamiliar faces. And what we may do with other race faces is that we may use features that are high, we have high perceptual sensitivity for them in our own race, but they may be of low perceptual sensitivity in the other race. Okay, so this is why we may get the other race effect. But the important thing is that they are learned from experience and mainly from experience with familiar faces. And again, they're used for familiar faces, and then we apply them for unfamiliar faces. And in order to account for the differences between familiar and unfamiliar faces, what I suggested that we should take into account also the fact that we have this conceptual knowledge that can also help us generalize across different images that are very different from one another, and we don't need to definitely find a perceptual explanation for that. Okay, so that was about familiar faces. We can go back to that, the discussion if you want. I want to move to a different question, which is how we represent the whole person. What's the neurorepresentation of the whole person in face and body selective cortex? So as we all know, we have face areas and body areas in our brain, and most of the studies that have looked at these areas have studied their representation with faces and bodies and body parts. And surprisingly, there are very, very few studies that have looked at the representation of the whole person in the face and body selective areas. And because the whole person is composed of two stimuli, like a face and a body, that each of them is represented in a different area, what we can do is we can think about the whole person as a compound stimulus that is composed of face and a body, and then study the neural representation of the whole person in the same framework that has been used to study the neural representation of multiple stimuli. So these are very beautiful data from 2 decades ago that were done. This is a single unit recorded study in early visual cortex that have looked at the representation of multiple stimuli in single unit early visual cortex. And what they show is that when we present the cell with two stimuli, a preferred stimuli and a non-preferred stimuli, what we found is the response of the cell is the weighted mean of the response to each of those two stimuli when they are presented separately. Okay? And what Heger and colleagues have suggested for this kind of response is that it may be that the mechanism that may account for this response, that the response of the cell is the response to the stimulus, and this response to the stimulus is normalized by the activity of neighboring cells. So neighboring cells that are selective to the non-preferred stimulus are actually suppressing the response of the cell that is selective to the preferred stimulus, and the response that we get to the two stimuli presented together is the weighted mean of each of them separately. Now, the same was found also in higher level visual areas. Was found both in neuroimaging studies in LOC and also in single unit recording studies in IT cortex. And again, the finding was that the response to two stimuli equals to the response of two, each of them presented alone, the mean response of each of them when they are presented alone. Now, interestingly, and this is data from Doris' lab that was published recently and also consistent with data that was published by Reddy and Kenwisher a few years ago, when two stimuli are presented in a face-selective area to a face-selective neuron, what was found is that there was no evidence for a mean response, but actually to a max response. The response of the cell to a face and an object is similar to the response of the cell to the face when presented alone. When the cell was presented with two faces, then this is when the response was similar to the mean response of the two faces presented alone. And what they suggested is that this is still consistent with the normalization model. It's just that we need to take into account that face cells are surrounded by other face cells. Okay? And this is why we get this effect of the surrounding cells that have the same category selectivity, whereas the neurons that are selective to objects don't have much influence on the neurons that are selective to faces. So what we were wondering is, given those different type of responses to multiple stimuli, what would be the response to the whole person in face and body selective areas? So one possibility is that we're going to find what was found with faces and objects, a max response. So when we present the whole person in the face area, in the body area, we're going to find the response to the whole person is going to be similar to the response of the face in the face area or similar to the response to the body in the body area, suggesting that we're actually ignoring the non-preferred category. However, faces and bodies are usually presented together, and they may convey similar information, so we may not want to ignore the non-preferred stimulus in that case. And also, we know that the face areas and the body areas and the neurons are located in nearby locations, so they may have some influence on one another. So another possibility is that we're going to find a mean response. The response to the whole person will be the mean between the face and the body. Or another possibility is that we're going to find a weighted mean response in which the weight for the body and the face is going to be determined by the preferred category. And the main advantage of this kind of representation is that we both give some dominance to the preferred category, but we don't ignore the non-preferred category. Okay? So it's still influence the representation. And then another possibility that we're going to find the sum of the response. So maybe because faces and bodies are always seen together, they are going to have some facilitatory connections, and we will find that the response is similar to the sum or maybe even above the sum. So to answer this question, we localized the face and the body areas, and we also presented the whole person, a face, and a body. And what we did is we tried to estimate the weights response to the face and weight to the response to the body that would best fit with the response of the person, okay? So we take the response to the body, and in order to estimate WF, the weight for the face, and WB, the weight for the body independently, we use multivoxel data. So we get the response to the body from 10. We started just with the 20 most selective voxels in each of the body and the face area. So the 20 most selective voxels to body, the face, and then we try to fit the response to the, find the best fit to the response to the person. So what I'm showing you here is and this is how I'm going to show you the results. This is WB, the weight for the body. This is WF, the weight for the face, when we are presenting the whole person. And if we find the data here that is consistent with the max response to the face, so the response to the whole person is similar to the response to the face, that would be max response to the body. That will be a mean response. This would be a weighted mean response in which the weight is larger for the face than the body, and that would be a sum response. Okay, so this is how I'm going to present the data. So we started with just looking at 20 voxels in the face and the body area, the 20 most selective one, and this is what we found across all our subjects for the face area. So you see that it's really on the line of the weighted mean, with a higher weight for faces and lower weight for bodies. This is what we find in the body area, okay, really nicely on the line. This is the data from all the subjects that generated this response. And basically, when we run statistical analysis, we find that the sum of WF and WB is not significantly different from 1. That's consistent with the normalization model. We also found that WF and WB are different. This is inconsistent with the mean response model. We find that WF and WB were different from 0 and from 1. That's inconsistent with the max response. And what we find is that we actually, in both pretty symmetrically, see that the response to the face is higher than the body in the face area, and from the body to the face in the body area, consistent with a weighted mean response in which both stimuli are actually influencing the representation of the whole person. What I'm showing you now is the same analysis, but instead of just looking at the 20 most selective voxels, we actually looked across the whole area by doing searchlight, in which we just use spheres of 20 voxels. And I think what you can see pretty clearly here, this is one subject, that whenever WF goes up, WB goes down. When WF goes up, B goes up, WF goes down. And this is consistent with the idea that the sum of the weights is 1. When one goes up, the other goes down. This is the correlation that we found. Before I showed you the correlation across subjects, that I'm showing you the correlation within subjects across voxels. We get very similar finding that the correlation is negative. This is just another subject, and this is the data across all our subjects. And when we try to run a regression model, we actually find that the intercept is 1. The coefficient is minus 93. It's really on the regression line that corresponds to the weighted mean. So the last thing I'm going to show you about this data is the question is whether, to what extent these weights are actually can be predicted if we measure the face selectivity and the body selectivity. So this is the face selectivity across those different areas, and you see that the face selectivity corresponds to WF, and the body selectivity corresponds to WB. And then what we did is we tried to predict the weight from both the face selectivity and the body selectivity. And you see that there are actually, both of them are predicting the weights of the face and the body. So it's both positive correlation of face selectivity. The higher the selectivity, the higher the weight for face, but also a negative correlation of the non-preferred category. The higher the selectivity to body, the lower the weight of the face. Again, suggesting that when we see the whole person, what actually influences the representation is both the selectivity of the face and the selectivity, which is the preferred, and the selectivity of the non-preferred stimuli. OK, so to summarize what I showed you so far, the neurorepresentation of the whole person is a weighted mean of the response to the face and the body. And the magnitude of those weights is determined by the selectivity, both of the preferred and the non-preferred categories. And I think that this is consistent with the normalization model, and it may also provide an explanation why we need face and body areas to be located in adjacent location. Because if we want to have a representation which takes into account both the face and the body, then we want to have some influence of the neurons in the face and body selective to be in neighboring location, adjacent locations. All right. So the last thing I would like to talk about is the role of motion in whole person perception. These are studies that were done by Noah Simchi in my lab. And what Noah did is she ran both studies in which we looked at the representation of the face and the body and the representation of the face and the voice, and asking what's the role of motion in the representation of either the multimodal representation, the face and the voice, or the face and the body. And what we find, and I'm going just to show you an example from one of these experiments, is that it seems that motion plays an important role in binding the information from face and voice and face and body. So when we present static stimuli, it seems that one of them may dominate the representation. But when you present dynamic stimuli, it seems that actually both of them are used in the multimodal representation. So I'm going to show you an example from studies in which we actually did a face-voice task. And this is an EEG experiment. And what Noah did in this experiment is she trained subject to identify voices. So this is voice number 1, this is voice number 2, this is voice number 3. And then she gave them a voice recognition task, okay? And the faces that are presented in this task are actually irrelevant to this task. So one condition was a voice alone task. So
Bye.
Okay, so you hear the voice, and the subject needs to tell whether this is voice number 1, 2, 3, or 4. You don't know because we didn't train you, but the subject should be able to do that. And then we present static faces and voices.
Bye.
Okay, the faces are irrelevant because they never seen the face before. They're just presented there. Okay, or they see a dynamic face. All right, and then we can ask whether by adding those faces is going to make any change to the representation of the voices, to our ability to recognize the voices. So this is the behavioral data. You can see that recognizing voices is much better when they're presented with a dynamic face, despite the fact that this is an unfamiliar face. It has nothing to do with the task. It's just presented there together with the voice. And this is the voice presented along. So you see this different in performance. And then the other thing that she did, and this is similar to what I showed you before with the faces and the body in the fMRI experiment, is to try to model the representation of the multimodal dynamic face or the multimodal static face using data, the EEG data from the voice, from a dynamic face presented without a voice, a static face presented without a voice, in order to see what's the contribution of the faces and the voices to the multimodal representation. And what you see here, this is a measure of WF minus WV. So if we see a negative response here, a negative finding here, it means that the weight for the voice is actually higher than the weight for the face. And this is what we find when voices are presented with static faces. Okay, so when the voice is presented with a static face, the voice dominates the representation. But when the voice is presented with a dynamic face, we see that the weights for the face and the weights for the body, for the face and the voice, are actually similar, suggesting that, again, despite the fact that it was an unfamiliar face, it was irrelevant to the task. Once we see a face together with the voice, we integrate them together, and faces are also contributes to the multimodal representation. And that may be consistent with the finding that dynamic faces are localized in areas that are in the STS, where we also have voice areas, and we also have dynamic bodies there. And this is also consistent with what Ellis and I suggested in our review a couple of years ago, that motion binds information from the face and the voice and the face and the body. So when we see people in motion, this is when those different types of information are actually integrated. And this is probably done in the STS, where all this dynamic information, the multimodal representation about the person, is represented. Okay, so I think I'm done. What I try to do today is to convince you that in order to understand how we recognize people in real life, we need to consider also other sources of information that we have about the person. That includes the body, the voice, and motion, beyond the face. And when you get to familiar faces, it's important also to consider the fact that familiar faces are actually concepts that are associated with conceptual information, and that this conceptual information may also play an important role both in face learning and in face recognition. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Galit. I was actually hoping that I could start with a question. So going back to the first part of your talk about the conceptual and perceptual information, can you say a few words about how you think those get integrated, or how the perceptual information or visual representation gets updated when the conceptual...
So the experiments I didn't show you today are experiments in which we study how conceptual information may be important for face learning. And one of the things that we show is that when you present a face with a label which is conceptually relevant to the face, then learning is actually much better. So what we think is actually going on is that when we study, in our real life, when we become familiar with the person, it's never purely perceptual. You always learn something about that person, right? You always know something about the person, starting with the person name, but then much more information. Maybe you don't even need much information, just having just one piece of semantic information about the person that helps you both to discriminate that person from different, that's what we call individuation, discriminate that person from other individuals, but also link different images of that person that are all linked to the same appearance. But then again, it's not that we don't use perceptual information. Obviously, we're not hopeless with unfamiliar faces. We can use invariant features and we can generalize across different appearances. But what I was trying to say is that this pretty amazing generalization that we see for familiar faces, at least to some extent, can be accounted for just by a conceptual matching and not necessarily changing the perceptual representation.
So you don't think that the perceptual information also gets updated as you're gaining conceptual information about the person? So for example, with familiar faces, you may actually expand, right, the distances in the face space because you're also updating.
So what I think is going on is that we have very rich perceptual representation because we've seen this face from different appearances, and that actually is going to be also represented in our representation in memory, right? Because again, the main difference between familiar and unfamiliar faces is that for the familiar faces, we have representation in memory. For unfamiliar faces, we don't have it. And that representation in memory can be very rich perceptually, but also linked to conceptual information.
So again, with regard to the first part of your talk, which is very interesting, when you had the deep network, you found out that the same type of features that were helping or hindering human perception were also helping and hindering the deep network. But I was then interested in understanding what are the actual deep features that are used within the network. Have you looked into that?
No, so this is actually, we talked about it before. I think this is hard to do, and we don't think that we may find those features when we look at them. I think the main advantage of this kind of experiments that they just provide us with hypotheses that we can test about the network. Because I think, if we don't know what the features that humans are using, you cannot ask what features, if the system is using the same ones. So once we have an hypothesis here, we could test whether the network is using the same features, but not necessarily that I can find them in the network.
Okay. With regard to the second part of your talk, bodies and faces, so Pawan Singha had a paper, I think, in Science a few years ago, where he showed that even if you had the blob for a very blurred blob as a face,
right,
but you had a body attached to it, the
right,
FFA would be active. But
yeah,
if you did not have a body, it would not be active, right? So I agree with you that bodies are very important. I'm very interested about your contribution, which is really nice, about the weights that are associated to each one. And I'm now wondering whether you've studied what happens if I actually switch bodies without changing the face. So for my face, you use bodies of different people from different genders, probably different ages, different ethnicities. And I'm wondering what's going to happen to the FFA when that happens.
Right, so I'm not sure the FFA is sensitive as much to different identities. I mean, we may need to study it. I'm not sure that with this method you can actually, maybe a female face, and a male body.
But the weight,
yeah,
the weights that you were finding, whether these are, they're going to change along that continuum, the line that you had, and they're going to go more toward the body when the body is
if it's inconsistent, you mean?
Yeah.
Right. So if it's totally inconsistent, then it should go towards the max, right? I mean that that would become similar to an object, right? I think that would be the maximal difference. The more relevant and consistent is between the face and the body, then you would go more towards this weighted mean response.
So I was wondering if you did this already, I missed it, but have you tried fMRI adaptation with these
Not yet.
critical features?
Right, right. I mean, that would be something that obviously should be done if I want to claim that this is happening in the FFA. But yeah, my expectation is that adaptation is going to be stronger for the high PS than the low PS. And if it's, Karlanit showed that the perception and the FFA are actually correlating, so correlated. So I would guess that that's my.
Sorry to be obvious.
No. I mean, that should be done. Yeah.
So I have a question, but I think it could be a little bit basic. So in computer-based systems, when two things take more or less the same time, it's a good approximation to think that they're doing more or less the same computation.
Okay.
So this morning, Ida was talking about familiar and unfamiliar faces being significantly different times. It takes significantly different time to do recognition of familiar and unfamiliar faces. In the brain, could we be computing features at different speeds? Maybe that's a basic neuroscience question, but I don't really know.
So why speed? I mean, you know, I mainly looked at accuracy, right? Or I mainly looked at similarity measures, not much at speed. You know, you may think that if you have higher perceptual sensitivity, you may be also faster, but we actually didn't measure that. That tasks were only used to measure distance or similarities or differences. But yeah, probably that could be also faster. I'm not sure.
But also for familiar for familiar faces, the time that it takes to recognize different people may vary, right? And for unfamiliar. So some people are easier to be recognized. It takes just shorter time to recognize them just because they are more distinctive or what have you. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean that we use different features per se. It just means they're more different.
So I guess the difference in time would be explained by how long it takes you to recall the descriptor of a given person.
Well, also the degree of dissimilarity, right? If something is very, you know, atypical, or you know, have very large differences in features, then that would take you less. Yeah, it's the distance.
In your analysis of the features that are critical for identity, it's kind of an average across faces. And when I think of familiar faces, or just look across here and look at people I know pretty well on the other side of the room, each one has a different distinctive feature that that I really use for recognition.
So you know,
and so this question about difference in time might be that with a fragment of a familiar face, and if when you look, you can pick out that distinctive feature for that is specific to that one familiar face that gets you to the target concept of the person very quickly.
Okay, so when we started that experiment, we thought that this is what we're going to find. We didn't realize we're going to find 5 features that are going to work across all different tasks that we're running. We thought that the critical features, and this is why we rate the features and also normalize them. So we knew for each face which one is the distinct features. And at the beginning, we just changed the distinctive features. But it didn't work as well. And this is how we actually find out at the end that there are actually some features that are invariant and are important for all faces. And maybe those distinct features are above and beyond that, right? And again, the distinctive feature can also be conceptual. So you know that this and that has a very large nose. So when you see a very large nose, you say, well, maybe that's that person.
Yeah, I mean, caricatures usually, artist-drawn caricatures,
right. So
computer-drawn caricatures. You take 1 or 2 features and over like Obama's ears, right?
No, definitely.
And this is what I was wondering, if you did a kind of the reverse approach, like presenting one feature and see if your subjects can recognize accurately who the person belonged to.
Yeah, right. So this is how we started that. And actually, before we started that, we went to interview caricaturists. So we went talking with them and we asked them, how do you know which features to change? How do you know which features to exaggerate? And we didn't really get a good answer. So this is why we started with doing science.
But you know, after the meeting you organized in Jerusalem,
there was this
that there was the artist. So that is actually my set of examples that I use to explain why
his features are also semantic. So this is Piven. I don't know if you know Piven. Just look it up at Google. I mean, amazing actually art that he's changing. He's making faces from objects. Okay. And he's using semantic features.
He's using just a couple of, I don't know, I'm not sure it's semantic. I think it's perceptual.
Some of them. Both.
Barbara Streisand, I still remember.
There was a microphone.
The microphone that was...
He's a singer, right?
It was not that much as the singer as kind of the proportion of the
So
face.
he's using both. I mean, she has a very large, distinct nose, but then he was also using the microphone. So you think a singer, and you think the nose,
But the Sadama was like a brush. I mean, I still remember because I was really struck. And it was just these single details
Right.
that clearly activate the percept of who the
Right.
familiar person is.
Right.
And just to respond to Ailesh, I don't think it's so much a distinctiveness. It's in terms of how fast the difference in reaction time between personally familiar and unfamiliar. Again, we have like a couple of experiments where both head view and eye gaze, and this was a visual search task where subjects were asked to report if the target had the same direction or a different direction of eye gaze in one task and head position in the other. And the difference was really striking. For personally familiar faces was 100 milliseconds. That I think it's really a lot.
I mean, a matching task?
No, it was just a visual search. You had to
search, right.
You had to report if the target, and could be familiar or unfamiliar, had a different eye gaze from the distractors. And so consistently there was an advantage for personally familiar faces independently of the number of the distractor. But overall, the average of the advantage was around 100 milliseconds. That again, I think it's a lot in a behavioral experiment. So, and I don't think, of course, it was based on distinctiveness. It was just the fact that familiar faces, again, as I'm going back, I think there is an optimization also early on in the visual processing due to the fact that you are exposed to it and your system learns, your visual system learns and learns. My hypothesis is early on, as the retinotopic experiment showed.
I'm a little bit uneasy about going too far down the path of local features that we have words for, like eyes and eyebrows and so on. One of the things that always appealed to me about PCA is that it does give you features, but the features are themselves holistic.
Yeah, but they're
And
not
that's-
invariant, the PCA. I think this is what Alice was talking yesterday about, the eigen faces, that they are not invariant across different appearances.
Well, what I think is quite nice about that PCA-based feature, though, is that it also gives you a kind of coarse to fine spectrum along spatial frequencies, which I think ties into maybe what you were talking about, differences in processing speed. I mean, you can get the coarse scale information much more quickly than the fine scale information, and so that might be a way of just bringing together ideas about processing speed that are kind of neurobiologically plausible, and connecting that to features. So.
I was wondering, for the first part of your talk with the face features, did you do any low-level scaling or measurements of how much low-level properties were changing when you made a feature change?
So, I mean, you can see part of it. We also measured the pixel differences between the faces, and that didn't predict performance. So we don't think that anything about it. Actually, the pixel differences are larger for the low PS features than the high PS features if you just look at pixel differences, because you change the color and you change the size of the face. So that would actually, if it's all based on low-level features, that would predict actually the opposite.
Because hair, if I recall correctly,
Right.
was one of the high PS
Right.
features, which
Right, so
was
except
just
from
the
hair.
thing that brought it up in my mind.
That's right. So hair was one of them, which was actually very large low-level difference, but the other ones are actually smaller low-level differences.
Thank you.
I had two questions. One's probably something you've done, given that you're a face person. So does the alignment of the face and the body affect the results that you got?
Oh, we don't know. So you mean that whether we are going to present them separately or,
they're,
yeah.
Misaligned, or if they're flipped in terms of...
Yeah, actually presenting. So this is what we found. So if we are going to flip them, then that will also, the prediction is that it's going to go to more to a max response, to a weighted mean response. But I mean, yeah, this is something that...
Okay. And secondly, so the face is part of the body, and we talk about it separately, especially at this conference or workshop here. But you know, the body has parts too. And is there reason to think that the body, you know, different parts of the body are represented separately from one another? I mean,
there are some studies
one
that
could do an adaptation experiment, I'm sure.
Right. I think there are a few studies that maybe Udi Zohari, I don't know if Galit, right? He was showing some body topy. Yeah, body topy in EBA, right? Not.
Sorry. So Udi Zohar is a neuron paper, maybe from 2011 or something like that. 2010, I might be a year off. Where he did like a retinotopy experiment, but with different body parts. So he parcellated the body to top, bottom, torso, limbs, upper limbs, and lower limbs. And so he has one body topy around the EBA, and if you look at the ventral surface, he didn't find, what I remember is he has like the face representation, and his torso representation is going to be medial to where you showed your result. It would go towards the PPA rather to the OTS. So I don't think your results could be immediately explained by his.
I think that we can use exactly the same method to study body parts, right? You just can estimate the weights of, you know, as many parts as you want and see whether you can use that to predict the response to the whole person, and then, you know, it can be done. Yeah.
Also, just for a disclaimer, in his experiment, because he's doing like a retinotopy experiment, he has multiple body parts in each wedge, so it cannot directly.
Yeah.
You'd have to do a computation to relate from that to your experiment.
Right, and and I think the important point is the fact that there may be a reason why we have all those face and body areas in adjacent location, because in order to get this effect of, you know, it has been called also competition or whatever, they need to be located in close proximity, and faces and bodies are always presented together, so it's a good reason to have that.
So I'm sorry, I left the room. I don't know if Brad asked this, but I'm glad to see parts getting their just desserts again over holistic processing. But how do you reconcile your results with the holistic processing?
Yeah, so I think that at some point we realized that holistic processing may not be correlated as well with face identity. I mean, I think what we're interested in here is face identity and how it's represented. And studies that have looked at individual differences have looked at to what extent holistic processing may account for face identity. And I think that it turned out that the correlation were not that high. So we just, you know, we used a different method, a different approach in order to try to come up with the critical features for identity, but we also used, you know, distances and face proportion. We just used different information in the face, and, you know, some of them turn out to be more important than the others.
So Isabel's shown that holistic processing correlates with face performance if you do the
there are a few
complete
studies on that. I just
composite
talked with Joe
paradigm.
about it yesterday. I mean, I think at the end the results are pretty disappointing.
I'm sorry, I missed.
I mean, there are a few studies looking at these correlations, and I think the results are pretty much mixed. But at the end, the correlations are not as strong as you would want them to be if that was something that was very important for face recognition.
It depends on whether you use the partial paradigm or the complete composite paradigm.
We're not going to get into the
complete
composite.
Bruno,
Maybe Bruno would like to.
I think
Bruno actually is going to give a talk, so maybe he's going to change the topic of his talk.
But the interesting thing about, I've seen sort of holistic parts-based representations can do a lot of the same things. So, I mean, if you take one of my representational in my networks with a holistic face representation, if you change the eyebrows, you're going to get a smaller projection onto that feature, right? So they are sensitive to parts as well as to configuration.
Okay.
Okay. Let's take a coffee break. Thank you, Galit.
Thank you.